Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Throwback 2022 episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This episode will be looking at the best and the worst of the year that was. For the essay update, we'll be looking also at the National Energy Plan update, and for the Africa Regional update, we'll be looking at the UN Security Council being debriefed by ECOWAS on the worsening insecurity in West Africa and the Sahel. And for the Global Geopolitics update, we'll be looking at the performance of Chinese exports in 2022. With me this episode is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this month?
Yes, hi, Sia. It's a new year. I have to have my hopes are up.
Yes.
Doing well, rejuvenated. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this year. It's meant to be a tough year, but I think we'll be tougher than this year. Yeah, okay.
When I say what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger, I hope we've become very, very strong after all these worsening bouts of load shedding and worsening economic situation we've been faced with.
Yeah, we have to be resilient. We are in Africa after all. Yeah.
Definitely. All right, without further ado, just a reminder to all our listeners on whatever platform you're listening through, hit the subscribe button to stay updated on all future episodes. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share it amongst your family and friends. So, we're starting this year on quite a busy note. In the essay update, a number of things have already taken place. Late last year, South African government enacted anti-money laundering legislation, along with amendments to existing protections of constitutional democracies against terrorism and related activities acts. And on the 1st of January this year, South Africa celebrated 25 years of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And more recently, on the 5th of January, Dragonfly Aerospace launched the first of 6 agri-focused satellites, the EOS Sat-1, which launched on the 5th of January. Sbu?
Yeah, well, it's nice that we're celebrating good things like the relationship with the Republic of China. That state is becoming more influential in the world, and I think we are in the right space. So I'm just concentrating on the nice parts for as we're starting the year, on the good stuff. So I think that's a good one.
No, I definitely agree with you, Sbu. I think we have to be a bit optimistic as we start the year. There's a lot that's hanging in the balance. And without further ado, let's take a throwback at the best and the worst of last year. So I'll start off with one of the stories that I think is the worst from last year. And that happened on the 11th of April when the Joint Committee on Ethics cleared Dr. Zweli Mkhize. So this was after the Joint Committee on Ethics members finalized their deliberations against the complaints, or in response to complaints that Dr. Zweli Mkhize's son had received a tender of around 460,000 rand that he had not disclosed, the Digital Vibe saga, if you remember that. And for me, this is just one of the worst stories in 2022, because of the level of the rot. I would understand specific people of political standing within the party being excused for their behavior, or even if the political party were to have some kind of impunity towards its members, one would understand. It's the politics of the party. But when our, democratic institutions such as the parliamentary institutions that are supposed to uphold high ethics and supposed to hold parliamentary members in to account, have basically just cleared him on frivolous grounds. I think the grounds that they made for him being cleared were that the son no longer lives in the house and as such can no longer be sort of classified or declared as a son per se, as is a sort of grown individual or an adult living on his own premises or his own household. And I thought that was so frivolous because, I mean, that pretends as though the personal relationship no longer exists. And, and for them to have cleared him at that high level of accountability was also very, very disheartening and gave me very little hope, really, that we could really rely on these institutions to hold people into account. And as we've seen, even with Chapter 9 institutions such as the Public Protector's Office now being embroiled in some of the political factionalism and the fights within the ANC and the ruling party. And I mean, these are institutions that are supposed to be independent, with them making findings against the sitting president and the public protector being suspended, and the saga continues. And so for me, it was just one of those last straws on already a political system that really does need to have what our former president used to call a social moral regeneration. I think it needs to start with our political leaders and cascade into the rest of the society. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, this Parliamentary Joint Committee on Ethics should rather change their name into something more because there was nothing ethical about their conduct. I mean, they were too technical, I think, and one gets the feeling that all of this is either holding on to a particular political party line, since the ANC is the ruling party has a majority in parliament, or at times they are transferring factional fights onto parliament. But then the parliament is supposed to have done much better than this, because there was a constitutional judgment concerning this kind of behavior, and they have never learned.
Yeah, and it even got worse. I remember there was a time that, I mean, they were taking even personal fights in the public domain instead of holding leaders accountable. There was a time, I think the board of ESCOM was called up to account, and it just became a squabble about personalities between the chair of that committee and I think the then chair of the ESCOM board. And for me, it's just like, okay, can we put those aside and just deal with the professional matter at hand? And it feels as though increasingly clear to me that our public figures, if the corruption wasn't an indicator of sorts of that it's quite clear that they struggle to separate personal over the public life and their professional lives.
Yeah, and after all of this, the same Dr. Mkhize was uh, he was nominated.
Precisely. And then nominated, and like this is the same political party that says there's a step aside policy, and basically all of this flying right in the face of that to say, well, I guess they ran out of candidates who could be eligible given that step aside policy, and so they had to rely on the one person who was cleared on very dubious grounds. Very, very, very interesting times we're in. And then for
We have
me,
to laugh.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, no, just saying we have to laugh at this, because it just becomes ridiculous sometimes.
Yeah, true, so true. And the sad part is that the people who are shortchanged are the public, and the average South African who still relies on public services. And you see it in how the government is trying to resolve the crisis in terms of energy in the country. It's becoming that thing of those who have the money to pay will get the services or resolve that public problem by privatizing it, and woe to the rest of the people who still rely on public services.
Sadly, yeah.
On that note, that takes us to what I think is amongst one of the best, I think, of 2022, but I still believe that more needs to be done. And that for me was the signing of the REIPP, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, Window 5, and the opening of bids for bid Window 6. So the government was able to procure there, I think, a total of 1,600 megawatts of onshore wind, 1,000 megawatts of solar, and bringing that to a total of 2,600 megawatts. I think, given the gap, there's still a lot more to be done. And would love to see a lot more of these programs. But I think, in the same vein, whilst we're resolving the issue on the supply gap or electricity supply constraint side, we also need to resolve the issues at the state, parastatal, because at the end of the day, resolving the issue by privatizing the matter doesn't resolve the issue for those who still rely on the public resources. And I think this is also a message that Minister of Mineral Resources, Gwede Mantashe, was echoing to say, whilst we continue to procure on emergency and renewable basis all of this additional independent power, we need to also make sure that we're fixing ESCOM so that it can play its role. It's just so sad. I'm not sure we'll be able to get there because whilst you sort the problem on the supply side, you're also taking away some of the paying customers that would help ESCOM in terms of its own financial challenges that it's faced with. And instead, what's happening is that the paying customers are probably going to get the independent power services, whilst the rest of the public will be faced having to bridge that financial gap through tariff increases like what we've recently seen. Smoo?
Yeah, yeah. Oh well, these are I said to these are said to be independent. Yeah, they are independent, but still, as you're saying, ESCOM, which is the power utility, is still the main buyer of this energy. So we will see how things pan out when municipalities start being the sole buyers of more localized power generation. Um, but to me, even though this is a nice story, there's still the fact that these projects are in far-flung locales. I mean, we're talking about the Northern Cape, the Eastern Cape, where there's not much demand for this kind of energy, and South Africa needs to up a gear because we've discussed this all of these projects, and all of this has been discussed for over a decade. But now what we need to do is jack up on the transmission lines. I mean, our transmission of investments running in the tens of billions. So South Africa needs to seriously consider prioritizing the electrical grid.
No. Most definitely agree with you there, Smoo. And I think, yes, at the end of the day, you still have ESCOM buy this, and I think so. There are 2 points I want to make. I think the one is that what they're privatizing through this process and the deregulation on the licensing side is the bigger chunk, which is going to come from the embedded generation. I mean, at the moment, you don't need to get licensing for up to, I think, 1,000 megawatts, or I think if not 100,000.
100 megawatts. Yeah.
100 megawatts. I think they've removed some of those restrictions late last year, in December. I think up to 1,000 megawatts now. So like at this point, it's almost as though like they pretty much have opened it up. Besides the bid windows for the renewables part, I think for that park that discussion aside, I think that then speaks to what you were mentioning, the embedded generation and how they're going to privatize that. And I think that's where a lot of the people with money are looking towards. The other thing is what you're saying, and precisely and I agree with you 100%. There's far-flung areas where there's limited demand, and now you're going to have to transmit all that energy, and there's also going to be transmission losses along the way. It's not the most efficient way to resolve the crisis, but it then again speaks to some of the challenges in that, these issues around the energy crisis have now been embroiled in some kind of political fights between the so-called purists on the renewable side and the transitional people on the other side. The people who are saying, let's not rush into net zero overnight. Let's have a just transition, and we need to look at alternative fuels in this transition, such as the use of gas to power as an alternative, because that also provides an opportunity to provide infrastructure for gas, which is something that South Africans don't use far close enough than they should in terms of the potential as an alternative source of energy. And because, the world, around the world, a lot of people use these sort of transitional fuels for their cooking and their heat sources, because it's just always generally cheaper and more effective than the use of electricity for heating and cooking. And they use then electricity for other issues or other things that cannot have alternative energy sources, such as electronics, charging of devices, etc. So for me, it's quite clear that again, the plans that are being made, the powers being produced, are just simply the result of these sort of political economy fights amongst the factions of who want net zero tomorrow and who want to push the renewables line, versus people who say, okay, let's have a transitional approach that resolves the energy crisis but also moves us towards net zero in the long run. And I think the country at the moment is not taking some of the most prudent steps, because what really is winning in this battle, I think, is the capital for new renewable sources. And it goes without saying, you see it in the government planning, you see it in some of the financing that's coming through, and they're totally crushing anybody who's going to have an alternative voice that speaks about transitioning rather than this sort of forced renewables overnight, everyone driving electronic vehicles, etc., which I think is, at this point for me, I'm starting to doubt or at least be skeptical about.
Yeah, and the one thing that you mentioned about this transitional energy source, which is gas, is that Mozambique is our next door neighbor, and there is that investment by the French Total. It's an energy source that can feed into our open gas turbines. We could even use that as an emergency supply. So yeah, gas as a for this transition will be a good bet. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just sad that we're not moving in that direction. Instead we were pushing these far-flung solar and wind projects, which everywhere else have been proven to be insufficient to provide baseload energy. But we're still pushing the envelope down this line, as opposed to, moving, yes, I agree, towards the nationally determined commitments we've made and net zero, but also resolving the energy crisis, which I think is a far more bigger issue than anyone is actually aware of, because it has so many social and other ramifications that just cascade into uncontrollable socio-economic challenges.
Definitely.
On that note, I hand over to you, Smoo, to take us through what you think is the worst and the best of 2022.
All right. I think let me start off with the best. I think that one should be. It's a bit of both, but let me start off with the best. The best is South Africa's stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Sure.
His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa clarified the South African stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and emphasized that the principle that members should refrain from threat of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. So, but yeah, that's all nice political speak. But what South Africa committed to was to the articles of the United Nations Charter, and we said we want to be sort of like on the fence line on this one. And I thought that was a very, very, very good stance that South Africa took, because at first there were contradictory statements made, and there were protestations within the country with many people saying, no, we should not take sides. And so the government backtracked quickly and the right messaging was sent. And what impressed me the most was how they stuck to their guns under pressure from the global north to pick sides. The West was saying Russia is this, that, and the other. But in the end, the government did not either, or they didn't get frightened when there were talks about sanctions and all that kind of thing. So that was a very good story from a geopolitical side for me last year.
Yeah, no, definitely. Look, and I think at the end of the day, a large part of this is going to come down to fighting for sides on the African continent, right? Historically, we've also been the intellectual foundations of even the Third World Movement, the non-aligned movement, which was founded largely by African leaders invited to Bandung at the Bandung conference, when they were still dealing with issues around the Cold War. I agree with you. I think it's very much a good stance to take a middle ground, and I think for me, in the doctrine of our foreign policy in South Africa, the silent diplomacy doctrine, I think this is where you should be silently diplomatic, especially on international matters that are far flung from where you are geographically or that have no major severe direct impact. Well, there's some to our partners in BRICS, and on the other side, we've got the Western nations also pulling on opposite direction, trying to get us to make a decision. And I think that's a strategic stance. However, where I would like to criticize, I think, the South African stance on this is that, you know, of course, as countries are deciding which side they're taking in this conflict and the matter, there's the issue of the economic ramifications and the direction that each side is taking. I mean, the issue of the increase in rates hike in the US is not only just responding to the inflationary issue, but also a way to dry up capital markets of any dollars that remain. And, that means that very little is going to be available for developing and emerging markets for investments, etc. And given the sanctions faced, against the other side, whether it's China through the trade war with the US or Russia as a result of the conflict, the alternative through the new development and BRICS coalitions has very limited resources to provide in that instance. And so countries also are making decisions on their own economic policy in response to this. So I think whilst our politics is non-aligned, and I think that's good, our economic policy has been very aligned with the West, given obviously where we sit as a country and the fact that we still rely on having to attract some of those capital flows to pay for our current account deficit. So we're also now caught in a rising rate cycle, which is an incoherent policy response to the current economic environment. And I think that to me is just one of the sad parts of the direction that we're taking as a country, that our politics is doing the right direction, but the economics, at least in this instance, is definitely choosing sides, and for better or worse, because either side doesn't seem stable. You're either facing a capital crunch and no foreign capital for investments if you're following the Russian or the alternative, the rest of the world side. And on the West, I mean, they're running headfirst towards a global recession. So in this instance, our economic policy, I think, for me, matters more than our political stance on the matter. And it's quite sad that the economic policy has taken a leaning that it does.
Oh, well, on that note, I think you nicely set me up to go into my next point about a story that was It is bad in a way, but at the same time, there is the good part in it. There's always the paradox. You were talking about a paradox there on this Russian story, where on the one side, on the political side, it's good, but on the economic side, it's bad, or vice versa. So our next story, the other story that stood out for me was South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership investment plan, which was endorsed by cabinet, and this plan says that South Africa will need approximately 98 billion US dollars over the next 5 years in order to achieve targets, the nationally determined contribution. So to me, this is a long-term commitment made by South Africa. In fact, it's a commitment to South Africa's investment strategy, which we're talking about, which is based on attracting foreign funds for development. The South African government is convinced that it has run out of money somehow, and that it has run out of fiscal space. So its solution is to finance development off balance sheet, relying on our state-owned entities to carry the bulk of its development obligations. Now, the problem with this model is that we have these public companies which have been hollowed out, as we're talking about ESCOM. There are others, Denel, that and the other. And now the government sees inflows of foreign investment as a bonus for the current account, as you were saying. The dilemma, however, is that these just transition targets are unlikely to be achieved or met by South Africa, because South Africa is aiming at getting in the region of about 20 billion US dollars annually for the next 5 years. This is a mammoth task. It's almost impossible to fathom. I mean, that's like that's like close to 300, more than 300 billion dollars. I mean, billion rand each year. Yeah, I don't know how they crunch these numbers, but it's just impossible to get. Meaning we won't get these targets. We just have targets that we won't achieve. Yeah. So it's both. We need investments. We need to do something about the shortage of aggregate demand in the economy. But relying on capital inflows is not the right way, in my mind.
Sure.
And the cost of building these will be astronomical, unaffordable.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's quite crazy. You say the 20 billion a year target. Just for perspective, we're talking somewhere close to 5% of GDP. We're not even expected to crack 1% of GDP growth this year alone. And this is the whole economy's productive force. And yet you've got government expecting to make that in capital inflows on an annual basis for 5 years. It's impossible. It's just another empty promise, I feel. And for me, this also was the reason why this to me was it's a bit of a mixed bag, because although you're right, we will need some investment to deal with the energy crisis. The sad part is that now this whole thing is muddled up in the geopolitics fight. The whole issue of the energy sovereignty thing is now linked to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the broader geopolitical shifting fights that are taking place. And so countries are now foiled to come up with these nationally determined contributions and investment plans, which completely destructive for economic planning, by the way, because this is just unexpected money dropping, in the capital markets looking for yield, and this is not money that's integrated into the growth and the endogenous growth, the local domestic growth of countries, and so you're kind of planning on someone's tip that you're not certain also whether you're going to be able to mobilize this money. And so it's just the worst thing to ever happen for any government's planning. You plan with your own resources. You don't plan with the resources you're imagining that they're going to
Yes,
magically appear, and those resources have their own agenda because they're looking for a return. And so yeah, it's just a
and
mess.
a big return at that. Yeah.
Precisely. And I mean, with the way interest rates are hiking now, you have to beat that 7%, 8% plus interest rate that the US is likely to end up with at the end of this year before you can actually find yourself as a viable option in the market currently. Because, the dollars are just going back, and it just makes more sense to send them back to the US or the advanced economies. So for me, it was also that moment when it was quite clear that the Russia-Ukraine energy crisis nexus thing is quite clearly developed, and that it was clear that there were three paths that are being charted. Countries were either you've bitten the pill of global warming and the net zero, which must happen overnight, and so everyone is shutting down their coal power plants, which backfired in the case of Europe. But for the advanced, for the emerging markets and developing countries, we're forcing them down this line. The middle part is, I think, the part where China is playing, which is so safe and so good for itself that they are actually building more coal power plants. Base load energy being sorted, the energy crisis risk being minimized, but at the same time they're building their own capacity in terms of renewable energy to benefit as one of the main sources globally for solar panels, etc. And so they're set to benefit and win whichever way this global fight ends. Then there's obviously the third part, which is, I think, the path Russia is taking, which is basically just complete denialism of climate change and global war. You put it nicely in a discussion we had this one time, and it was quite clear to me that you're so right. The issue of the energy sovereignty and the just transition, net zero, is now embroiled in this geopolitical fight, and there's a lot of capital in the markets sent out to have that fight, because the fight isn't just happening in Kiev and Ukraine and Russia. It's happening on capital markets. It's happening
Yes.
in the halls of the UN institutions. It's happening at the allocation and the approval of projects. It's happening on multiple levels. And I think a lot of our leaders are just blindsided by this opportunity. Oh, there's a wave of capital. And my only hope is that at this stage, I just hope African countries generally have learned to find a way to take advantage for their own benefit rather than being taken advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tightrope that we, especially for low income countries. I mean, Russia might win the political fight. I mean, they might win the military conflict, but then you've on the other side you've got the economic side where you've
Mm,
got the IMF and the World Bank financing Ukraine,
mm,
meaning meaning that this war will continue. There's no urgency towards ending the physical fighting because the capital markets are also involved. You're so right. So
mm.
we are in a quandary anyway.
Yeah, no, it's a very sad. And I mean, you're talking billions, and I think you think of the plans that they made to support African countries with the just transition a couple of years back, and like the amount of money they've just spent on the Ukraine conflict, and you're like, guys, you could have solved all these climate issue problems long ago.
Exactly.
So clearly, there's no commitment about that. This is just being peddled for your own political benefit. So yeah, it's sad. On that note, that brings us to the last story in the essay update, and That's on the National Energy Plan update. And on the 12th of Jan, President Ramaphosa remained seized with finding a sustainable solution to the energy crisis through regular briefings on the situation at ESCOM and rolling out of the National Energy Plan. The National Energy Plan includes interventions such as removing previous licensing thresholds of 1,000 megawatts, and in addition, ESCOM has identified up to 1,000 megawatts of additional power to be imported from Mozambique and other countries in SADC region. The plan also explores a net billing framework, and which is expected to later establish a feed-in tariff to credit residential and industrial customers for any surplus energy they're able to feed into the grid. And this is the embedded generation story we were talking about earlier, Smoo. And the implementation of the plan the implementation of the National Energy Plan has also completed exclusion of transmission infrastructure from environmental approval in areas of low and medium environmental sensitivity throughout the country. And meanwhile, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NERSA, has approved ESCOM's application for a tariff increase of 18.65% for the financial year 2023-2024 and a further 12.74% increase in 2024-2025. And ESCOM had actually initially applied for an annual increases of 32.17% and 22.52% for the respective financial years. Smoo?
Yeah, well, the biggest impediment concerning the National Energy Plan and all these goals that they've set out is that there's no urgency. Just is not there. I mean, they've been talking and talking and talking. And they're talking. I'm happy that they're talking about importing gas from Mozambique. These things have been said before, but they should just get on with doing some of this work. Because we have a crisis, and I don't think even our president appreciates the gravity of what we have on our doorstep. But anyway, you have mentioned the NERSA, the regulator that is, I mean, they are, in my mind, completely out of sync with the economic reality, like our president, especially the hardships faced by households. Much of South Africa's GDP share is from households. 60% is consumer based. And so if you're killing that 60%, you're actually killing the economy. The demand for energy also is deliberately being dried out. What will happen is that those who can afford will go out and buy solar panels, they will move off the grid, and then those who don't have enough money will continue to connect onto the grid illegally. And so this is just turmoil. I think ESCOM got exactly what they wanted. I mean, they must have inflated their targets. I mean, they were looking at something like 32% and 22% the following year. But overall, they got 32%. And I'm sure they're smiling all the way to the bank, because we must remember that Andre de Ruyter kept on saying, when we were facing stage 6 the last time, he said, South Africans are paying too little. South African energy is too cheap. We should hike it up. So basically, he's thinking in order to resolve ESCOM's incompetent mismanagement and that South Africans should pay more. And we both you and I know that the higher your cost of energy, that dries out your manufacturing sector.
Precisely.
And so you don't have jobs. So I don't know what these people are thinking. I mean, the president even said himself, he says, my hands are tied. I mean, this is a president who anyway, I don't know.
No
Let
executive
me not.
order from our president, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I know, NERSA is an independent body, but
Mm,
you call people up and you say to them, "This is our situation." You call up the finance minister. You sit down with them. This is our situation. Okay, you make your decisions independently, but this is where we are at.
yeah.
Which brings me back to what I was saying earlier. He does not understand the gravity of the problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The guys are completely. I mean, it's insane. How do you approve 18.65% increase in the financial year 2023? I mean, inflation currently we're just reaching 4.55%, and you're going to triple inflation in terms of the electricity cost increase. Now, what's going to happen is that that's going to cascade, right? Because in many cases, people buy their energy from municipalities, right? So ESCOM's going to pass this on to municipalities, municipalities going to pass it on to you. So now you've got already two layers of inefficiency. Inefficiency at ESCOM, inefficiency at local government. By the time it hits your bill, it's already in excess of 20% in terms of the effective increase on consumers. It's insane. And at the same time, these guys are also hollowing out the market for ESCOM by not resolving the energy supply constraint issue, because as you said, those who can afford are going to end up going off grid. That's customers that ESCOM could be charging for electricity.
Uh-huh.
And once they go off grid, you probably see them in 15 or 20 years again, if and when replacing or maintaining their infrastructure is not going to be cheaper than buying it from ESCOM. So you've got people who will always be playing that arbitrage between being off grid and being on grid, and that just undoes the finances of ESCOM forever. Yeah, I just don't know how we're going to resolve this one. And then again, like I said, it's stacked up for people who still rely on public resources, because, as I say, you're not only dealing with the financial mismatch that ESCOM is trying to finance through these increases and the inefficiency that these increases are also hiding, you're also dealing with the inefficiencies at a municipal level, because now those are going to be passed on to you as well. Yeah, it's just a dire situation. On that note, that brings an end to the essay update for this month, and that takes us to the Africa regional update. A lot happening in Africa as well, and first off, on the Horn of Africa is facing the worst drought in 40 years, which is affecting Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. And ECOWAS observed free and fair elections in Benin on the 8th of Jan. And Uganda has declared the end of the Ebola virus outbreak on the 11th of January. Meanwhile, the SADC chair on politics, defense, and security condemns the alleged war crimes by Samim forces in Cabo Delgado on the 11th of January. And lastly, inter intra EAC, intra East African Community Trade, has exceeded $10 billion for the first time in 2022, placing it at approximately 20% of total EAC exports on the 12th of Jan. Smooth.
Well, I'll tell you what's depressing. It is the drought in the Horn of Africa. I mean, I don't know how Somalia has been hit by these droughts. They've been hit by the rebels, the uprisings there, and all sorts. The last time there was a swarm of locusts,
Yeah.
which destroyed half of their agricultural production. So droughts. Africa faces a lot of droughts, especially all along the southern part of the Sahel, stretching from Somalia in the east all the way through to the west, to West Africa. Yeah, it's concerning.
Yeah, no, those issues are quite severe, and I always say, of our development partners, if you want to gauge the sincerity and the seriousness which they had want to help us, is they'll be helping us deal with three problems: the problem of insecurity, the problem of climate change resilience, and the energy crisis. Anything else that they might put on your agenda is pure misdirection and actually more about their benefits than us. I think for me, those are really crucially the three major constraints that are holding back Africa's development in every way.
Precisely.
On that note, that takes us to my best and the worst of 2022. For me, the best of 2022 was, well, let's start off with the worst rather. The worst of 2022 in the Africa regional updates was on the 22nd of September when the ECOWAS was dealing with challenges in Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali. The ECOWAS Summit of Heads of State had a meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly to discuss some of these challenges they faced and a few things that they had took note of and issued statements were condemning the coup in Burkina Faso, which worsened the political turmoil. And then was the issue around Guinea, them not finding a transitional plan that could work within the time frame set out by ECOWAS, and obviously the issue in Mali where 46 Ivorian soldiers were detained, and the summit calling on their unconditional release. And for me, this was just one of those worst crises that are facing the West Africa and the Sahel region. Um, and it's quite strange because, for the most part, I think the unconstitutional changes in power in this region, I don't think are understood at a nuanced level. I think most people simply think it's military juntas taking over from civilian rule, and that's a bad thing. But in the case of Burkina Faso, for example, that military junta taking over the civilian rule was actually supported mainly because of the poor support that the previous regime was able to provide the public against terrorism and rising insecurity in the country. Similarly, in the case of Guinea, where again a military junta and the takeover had some level of public support, especially if you see the demonstrations around the time when the military junta took over. And the sad part is that, on the one side, we're sort of condemning these things, but on the other side, it's almost as though the public support is actually trying to correct for a political problem that seemingly the ballot is either too far out or cannot resolve. In people being able to choose and express their decision through democratic means, and hence the reliance on these coups. Again, I am not supporting coups, just mainly just highlighting, I guess, the nuances in terms of what's really taking place in West Africa. Obviously, there's other elements involved as well, such as the regional ISIL terrorism elements, as well as the involvement of foreign militias and private military groups from around the world, including the United States, France, and Russia. So, yeah, that to me was, I think, amongst some of the biggest and worst challenges that Africa or other African regions were facing, particularly West Africa, in 2022. Smo?
Yeah, man, countries were trying, were sort of like recovering and trying to get better. So it brings us back to the old conversation we usually have about security being intricately linked with underdevelopment. I mean, if you have underdevelopment, then you are likely to have security issues. And security is critical. Peace is critical for democratization, because if you don't have peace, then you don't have. I mean, like you were saying, people end up losing hope in the entire the voting and all of that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we would like to reach a point where there is peace, but now getting there is a very difficult subject, especially once you've had conflict. And now countries which are in distress, they need international intervention. But the problem is that we've got all of these players, talking about France and talking about the US, who have got embedded interests. And also now you also have the Wagner Group from Russia, who are also in Africa, in West Africa, in Central Africa. So I don't know. You need intervention, but you need someone to assist who is sincere to assist these countries in that recovery process.
Look, I think what's also clear to me is that the global geopolitical system is clearly benefiting out of the instability and the insecurity on the continent. And that's why we get embedded conflicts, such as what we've seen in the eastern parts of DRC, where rather than resolving the conflicts, I mean, yes, there's some geographical issues of constraint and concern there, but the problem, the point I'm trying to highlight is that where you've got parts of the country still functioning and in just parts of the country that are rotten or rotting, and places that people have either found a way to live around or avoid in altogether. And I think the status quo can continue despite these conflicts. And I think that's really what these conflicts are also highlighting into that dimension, that part of the issue is that it's very profitable for a lot of other countries and stakeholders in these conflicts, for African countries not to resolve the insecurity. Um, some of the stories I've heard of the operations that, despite China contributing the most contingents towards a UN mission in the west of the DRC, they're also the most active economic firms extracting resources in the south, in Lubumbashi, etc. And so, on the one hand, you have to question how they continue to get involved in yet cannot resolve this conflict, and at the same time business continues as normal.
Yeah, profiting from the conflict.
Most doubt, no doubt, no doubt. On that note, that takes me to what I consider some of the best of 2022, when the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, found a peace agreement with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. They signed a cessation of hostilities agreement, which signals their commitment towards the end of the use of force to settle their differences and disputes. And this took place on the 11th of April. I'm actually surprised now. I think I'll have to check that date. I'm not certain. Actually, it took place recently on the 22nd of November, that they signed this peace agreement, which was brokered by the AU High Representative to the Horn of Africa, former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, and former South African Deputy President Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, as well as a former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, who had facilitated the peace talks. So for me, especially for a country that had shown such potential and was on a really good trajectory in recovering and growing out of poverty, which has just been stymied by the civil conflict, is Ethiopia, and it's quite a sad case. I do hope that the peace sticks and they find a sustainable path towards stabilizing the country in favor of continuing to grow and develop for the Ethiopian people.
Yeah, I also think the signing of the peace agreement was an admirable was a great achievement. I mean, it was welcomed by all. The civil war in Tigray had plunged that region into both a humanitarian and an economic crisis. I mean, every time I looked at pictures from there, I would see these women, these babies, and all of those pictures that we saw way back in 1986 of Ethiopia. It was in the same region where there was that big drought there, famine. Yeah, yeah. But what remains a sticky situation is the continued presence of foreign military forces. I'm talking about Eritrea, who are still there, and there are all these allegations that they were involved in heinous crimes against the local population, especially children and women. So there was a rape was used widely
Mm.
wildly as a weapon of war. So, will there be any justice against these perpetrators? Will they be brought to book? What about these war crimes? Um, I mean, I would love for peace to be buttressed on justice. That's what I would like. I mean, it would be a lasting peace because people still need to heal. Um, there are still calls from the local population for the resumption of civilian services, things like banking and proper internet communication. Um, there are promises. I mean, things like air travel has returned, and there is a sense of normalcy in the air, but much still needs to be done. Yeah, but the signs are promising, though.
On that note, I hand over to you, Sbu, to take us to the best and the worst of 2022 for you.
Let me start off with the best. Um, it was the SADC PPDF approved. Uh, they approved 20 million US dollars in project preparation funding.
Mm.
Um, the SADC Community Project Preparation Development Facility approved 20 million US dollars for the preparation of 12 regional projects. Um, and the funding came from the European Union and Germany, to be particular. There are lots of projects. I won't
Mm.
name all of them, but they are in Zambia, in South Africa, Zimbabwe, DRC, all over the place. Um, what was most interesting for me was that there was the development of guidelines and standards for renewable energy projects, including the funding of incentives um, to move towards renewable energy. Um, so I think what is commendable is that um, South Africa, they are concentrating on developing skills, um, because once you've developed guidelines and standards for renewable energy, and you've got skilled people uh, who can iron out all the bottlenecks, then you are a for away. I mean, the funding incentive strategy is also to be commended. Project preparation for funding of renewable projects is actually very crucial, since it has become apparent that renewable energy projects, rather than large scale coal power generation projects, will be the way forward for the SADC region for the foreseeable future. This, then there's also the SADC SAPP, which is the power pool uh, transmission system that needs to be improved, because, as we were talking earlier, there are there are shortages of power. There are power shortages in each and every country in SADC. So you need to share uh, power, excess power. I mean, you trade in excess power. So when Zambia and Zimbabwe are facing drought in the Zambezi River with their hydroelectrical plant, they can tap into South African resources or Botswana resources and all of that, because these renewable energy projects are decentralized. So you need proper transmission lines. So I'm happy that they are thinking about transmission lines. And yeah, I mean, we need to share. We have to have a proper regional power pool for energy. So
No,
so it was a
definitely.
good story for me.
Yeah. Look, for me, I 100% ticks all the boxes. Just two things. We need more and push the volumes. You know, like the thing about project preparation and project investment and infrastructure generally is that it's a numbers game. And, out of a list of 12 projects, you probably will end up with funding for three. So we need to push the volumes, prepare as many projects as possible. And it's quite sad that really the SADC region hasn't taken advantage of the historical zero and negative interest rate period where a lot of advanced economies were in search of yield elsewhere. Now we're entering a phase where there's going to be significant capital drying up because of the conflict, because of the rising rates in the West and other advanced economies. And so the SADC region is really going to struggle to find capital to invest in these projects. But we need to have the projects prepared and ready to be funded. And for me, one of the things that stands out quite clearly in all these projects is that these are projects that promote regional integration. There's not a single one of them that's just located in one country. And, it's only through these collective and regional projects where we work together where we will start establishing those ties that push and extend the trade towards capital ties, towards freedom of movement of people. I think this is really the foundation of regional integration. And, just signing off agreements on without laying the groundwork through the infrastructure, through the trade, is just generally going to be pie in the sky or dreams. And for me, this is the groundwork that's necessary to support regional integration.
Yep, agreed. Then on to my worst story. It happened way back in May 10th. It was ECOWAS to collaborate with NATO on climate change and security. We talked earlier about climate change and security. Now, the Directorate of Early Warning of the ECOWAS Commission held a working session with NATO, Strategic Direction South Hub at the ECOWAS headquarters in Abuja, Nigeria. The session aimed to explore potential collaboration and mutual interest for climate change, fighting against terrorism, piracy, capacity building, but this was also linked to renewable energy with energy. So, for starters, NATO is a military organization.
It was a mess. This story, it was a mess.
It's really laughable how this one is brazenly disingenuous. I mean, NATO, it is a NATO initiative. And I don't know what ECOWAS was thinking. I mean, how did they make?
It's free money. Again, I think we were misguided to be chasing all this free money. It's like, this is the sad thing about development that's not indigenous or capitalized by local capital and local money. If you're not funding your own development, you're going to jump at all these opportunities trying to make the most of everything. And you get played in the process.
Yeah, it brings us back to the earlier conversation about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the energy crisis that came out of that. I mean, it's pretty clear for everyone to see that this assistance will come with strings attached. that ECOWAS has to support NATO's fight against the Russians, and if they do that, they will get renewed.
The biscuit. Yep.
Just the biscuit. So,
yeah, look, for me again, like the timing of these exercises just awfully suspicious, because they coincided also with Secretary Blinken's visit to Africa, right? Which is said to be also in preparation for the Biden visit supposedly taking place this year. So to me, it was clear that this was just another geopolitical play. Nothing's wrong with that, but I just hope as African countries we've learned to take advantage of all and any opportunities to advance our own development rather than just being used, in these geopolitical fights. And Yeah, yeah. Look, it's sad, right? I agree with you. We do need earnest development partners. It's just that Europeans generally have proven to be very self-interested, like at the cost of everything else, really. You know, as we've said earlier, we're discussing all these the geopolitical issues, climate change, and they have all these promises they make. They're going to support developing countries, and the minute something that's in their interest happens, forget everything else that they had planned. They're going to pump all the money towards it. I mean, you saw the European countries. On the one hand, they were turning off coal power plants. The minute the gas pipes, were drying up from Russia,
Exactly.
they were turning those coal power plants back on, and forget everybody else. So it's sad. I mean, that's the reality of who we're dealing with. I think we must acknowledge that and move on with the times. And again, for me, it comes down to this. I don't think the biggest challenge, I think, apart from the conflict, as we mentioned earlier, the energy crisis, as well as the impact of climate change and the lack of investment in adaptation on the continent, a large part of it is that we're not spending our own money to resolve these problems. And like, if you're
That's the
spending
problem.
other people's money, you're going to be forced to, import goods from their markets, and they're going to be given turnkey solutions. You're going to be told to jump this many hoops, jump that many, obstacles, and at the end of the day, it's always going to be in their favor. For me, one of the biggest eye-opening times in my career as an economist was realizing that, what countries call official development assistance and aid, it's not about aid. It's actually industrial policy of the advanced economies, because what they do is they give you this money, but you can only spend it on companies from their countries. So the money
Uh-huh.
circulates back, and like, that's not about helping you. That's about helping them. And I
Yeah, you
think
have to.
we just need to realize that, and move with the times.
Yeah, they make sure that you have to export all those profits.
Yep.
You import the money, you export the profits. Yeah,
And then you service all that money through further profits in terms of the interest rate they charge.
exactly, exactly.
Anyway, on that note, that takes us to the last story in the Africa regional update. ECOWAS briefs the UN Security Council on worsening insecurity in West Africa and the Sahel. So, on the invitation of the permanent representative of Japan at the UN, the president of the UN Security Council, ECOWAS briefed the UN Security Council on the political and security development in West Africa and the Sahel region. So ECOWAS also briefed the UN Security Council on its work with the UN Office for West Africa and the Sahel, the UNOWAS. ECOWAS debriefing highlighted some of the challenges confronting the region, such as terrorism, violent extremism, unconstitutional changes of government, and their impact on socio-economic development of the region. ECOWAS reiterated its commitment to tackling these challenges, strengthening the zero tolerance policy towards power obtained or maintained by unconstitutional means, and activating the ECOWAS standby force to fight terrorism and address to unconstitutional or challenges to constitutional order in the region. So the UNOWAS activities in the past 6 months have included promoting political consensus and ensuring a level playing field ahead of elections in countries such as Nigeria, as well as promoting conflict sensitive best practice on climate change adaptation with youth and women groups in the region. Smooth?
Yeah. What caught my eye was Nigeria in the story. I mean, of all the countries bordering the Sahel, Nigeria seems to have the most acute and the longest challenge concerning the internal turmoil, and which has taken countless lives and resulted in internal displacement of peoples. I understand why Nigeria is big. It's I'm sure it's the biggest um, member state in the bloc,
Mm.
but their problems are persistent, and yet the Nigerian government, uh, well, have got all this power. They've got everything in their disposal to make. I mean, they are the biggest on GDP. They are the biggest economy on the continent. So they should be able to deal with these problems, the terrorism and that has engulfed that entire region.
Let me pick up on what you're saying on Nigeria, because for me, I see clear parallels between Nigeria and West Africa in its impact on the region and regional security, as well as the DRC and its impact on the Central African Great Lakes region. Because, these internal conflicts, without being resolved, will obviously spread into the region. But I think at the same time, we need to understand the internal political economy of these conflicts. There's surely somebody who's benefiting from the sustained conflict. What I find amusing or interesting about Nigeria is that they also provide the biggest contingent when it comes to that regional ECOWAS force, right? They are quick to intervene in neighboring countries such as the Gambia when there's unconstitutional change in power, and other countries where there's attempted coups, but cannot resolve the internal issue of Boko Haram and extremism in Nigeria, as well as the petty kidnappings, etc. And even worse issues if you look at some of the Niger Delta and environmental impact of bunkering, etc., that's taking place there. Um, and so for me, those kinds of conflicts aren't conflicts that, I think those are conflicts that are systematic at this point. It's been what,
Yeah,
over a decade that the 200 girls went missing, and
exactly.
they've not found, half of those girls. Um, it's just that now those conflicts are so systematized, and also the rest of the country is still operational. For me, that's one of the pointers and indicators that shows me that the conflict has been systematized, when you've got one half of the country operating as though it's normal and business as usual, whereas the rest of the country is either a no-go zone or you're at a high risk. And that's precisely why I draw these parallels between what's happening in the DRC or eastern parts of the DRC and what's happening in the northeastern parts of Nigeria. I've heard rumors of people saying, the northeastern parts of Nigeria are so poor and so underdeveloped that for a large part, people's people's livelihoods have actually improved somehow by being provided camps such as the asylum camps, etc., where they're running away from the terrorists as opposed to living their lives normally without any government intervention. So I think it's some of these nuances that then allow us to understand why these conflicts never get resolved and why they drag on forever. Just a reminder to all our listeners, regardless of whatever platform you're listening through, hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all future episodes. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share it amongst your family and friends. On that note, that takes us to the Global Geopolitics update in brief. On the 31st of December, His Holiness Pope Emeritus Benedict is at the 16th passed away. And on the 8th of January, Bolsonaro supporters were involved in riots and invasion of the Brazilian Congress. And the World Economic Forum is set to be held from the 16th until the 20th of January this month. And lastly, the Fed Open Market Committee is set to meet on the 30th of January and the 1st of February. Spoon?
Yeah, Bolsonaro and his supporters. I don't know why he had to imitate what Donald Trump did, him and his supporters.
He is a protege, he did idolize Donald Trump. So they say what, the leaves don't fall far from the tree, eh?
I'm telling you. I mean, the far right is uh, the far righters, I don't know whether they are in the ascendancy or they are declining now. I'm not so sure. I mean, Bolsonaro lost by a whisker against Lula da Silva, and Donald Trump also seems to think that he can come back and win the presidency. So I'm not sure what's happening in the
Mm.
Americas with right wing politics, but they're not waning. I thought they would by now. They would
Yeah.
be.
Look, I think it is also a political climate that kind of encourages conservatism, right? Given the uncertainty globally, most people are tending to look internally, right? And the easiest thing to do is to push the nationalist line to say, in the state of flux that the global economy is in, everybody is not sure which way we're headed. The one thing that will always keep us aligned and agreeing on is what's in the national interest. And so, in this context, it is a political climate that encourages conservative thought. The globalists are on the back foot right now, right? Given the multiple failures of even the global financial experiment, given the last financial crisis and the expectations that there's a pending global recession, and even on multiple other issues in terms of socioeconomic issues, the liberals are just out of their depth. I mean, how do liberals deal with the problem of rising inequality in the global political economy? They just and further globalization isn't going to resolve that, right? So yeah, I think it's one of those, but they're falling over each other through blunders and mistakes that they're not actually seizing the moment. So that's why you're not sure are they going up or down. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
On that note, that takes us to the best and the worst of 2022 from my view. So for me, I would say one of the worst things that happened, at least from the geopolitics section, and I think given that we haven't really covered much earlier this year in this segment, a lot of what we'll be looking at has happened quite recently. But I suspect there have been worse issues, such as obviously the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, etc. But I think we'll only be covering what happened towards the last quarter of last year. And for me, it must be the US Fed raising rates, taking us completely out of the low interest rate, zero negative interest rate environment, and heading straight towards what some are actually speculating as a pending global recession. So it was on the 14th of December, the most recent hike by 50 basis points, raising federal fund rates to 4.25 to 4.5%. Meanwhile, the US is still facing high inflation at 6.2% in September, against a target of 2% over time. And so, what the Federal Reserve is expecting that these further interest rate hikes are expected to moderate demand and at the same time then reduce inflation. But, as we've said multiple times on the show, there's a serious policy incoherence issue because what the US is facing in terms of inflation in advanced economies right now is actually more linked to the energy sovereignty issues, whether that's relating to the Russia-Ukraine issue, or in the US, I think it's partly the stimulus during COVID of around $6 trillion, as well as the global supply chain disruptions that are still linked to the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the challenges out in China in terms of the zero COVID policy and China slipping back into lockdowns, etc. So these are supply side, predominantly supply side inflationary issues, which interest rates, although can resolve, are not geared towards resolving them directly and effectively in the shortest time. So yeah, for me, this is just one of the reasons why this is a bad thing. And given the influence of the US Fed, as it raises rates, all countries that rely on capital inflows, such as South Africa, have also had to raise rates. And so a number of countries have had to follow in suit by raising their rates, but who face different issues. I think South Africa currently isn't facing high inflationary issues, although inflation is above 4 to 5%. It's still within the 3 to 6% target band that our government our central bank targets. So I'm not certain that the current and speed of rates increases in South Africa was necessary had it not been for the US Federal Reserve raising rates, which would have ultimately starved South Africa of capital inflows. Small?
Yeah, I think you're reading it very well this year. Um, and I'll also say for as long as the US has not sorted out its supply side economics, then that target range of around 2% will be very difficult to achieve.
Yeah,
They could be lucky though with the, as you mentioned, the slowing global economy, which will bring down demand slightly though, but not so much. But I don't see them still getting lower than 4%. One has to factor in that Joe Biden's IRA, which is the Inflation
Reduction
Reduction
Act.
Act,
Mm.
seeks to increase local productivity and production manufacturing in the States. And it will also shift manufacturing away from old technologies to new, because it's linked to the to the net zero craze. But now this will in turn have an impact on the availability of resources, because the when everyone is has t- if everyone has targeted 2030 and 2050 and 2060 as points to attain a level of uh, reductions in gases, um, then it means that all of them will be chasing fewer resources, and that will be inflationary. So I don't think inflation in the States will reach 2% in the next year or so, or in the next 5 years, I think.
Mm. And not while they're still having sanctions against Russia, which is globally the reducing the supply of oil, which raises the cost of carbon-based fuel and energy, which we still rely on heavily at this point. And also, without them resolving the trade war against China, which produces so many goods for them, they're going to import all that inflation through these policy measures, whether it's sanctions or it's tariffs against China. And so, even if they are able to reduce domestic demand to a certain extent, I agree with you, they're not going to reach 2%. Just mainly because these inflationary supply side constraints are not even being touched by some of these policy measures.
Exactly.
And on that note, that takes me to what I consider some of the best in the global geopolitics from 2022, and that's the EU DSA entering into force on the 1st of November. So, the European Union Digital Services Act, the DSA, which includes rules for safer and more accountable online environments, entered into force on the 1st of November. So, the DSA applies to all digital services that connect consumers to goods, services, or content, and the DSA's key goals are to be a proportionate, foster innovation, growth, and competition, and facilitate scaling up of smaller platforms, SMMEs, and startups by introducing sets of rules for online intermediary services on how they have to design their services and procedures in order to ensure that they take the responsibility and limit the spread of illegal content, illegal products online, and increase the protection of minors and give users more choice and better information. Smo?
Yeah. These online platforms, I see where they were given only 3 months. It's a very short space, a very short time. And their users have to be, they have to report on active users by before the 23rd of February. That is like in a few weeks'
Mm.
time. So how far are they in this process? Do you know?
No, no, I haven't been keeping track of this story. But look, I mean, these are online platforms, highly digitalized. They're just reporting, right? So it's about them reporting on their databases. I suspect, in terms of their compliance with the DSA requirements, what they will most likely be able to do in these 3 months is to set new user or end user licensing agreements. And so it's literally just a legal exercise for them. The bigger part, I think, which they'll never be able to accomplish in the 3 months, is being able to establish a complete monitoring of activities on their platforms in order to remain in compliance. So what they can do is get users to agree to comply, but the monitoring process and them being able to weed out instances of people not complying is the more difficult part, which they will never be able to achieve in the timeframes provided.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then on that note, that takes us to your worst and the best of 2022. So over to you, Smo.
Yes, you know, on, on this one, I've got just the one story. It is the best story, and it's also the worst story for me.
Sure.
I mean that, as you know, at Ubuntunomics, we try to concentrate on paradoxes. Try to uncover the nuances and all of that. But because in most cases there are always good sides and bad sides of 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 even a single policy position. So yeah. Anyway, it was the COP27 held in Egypt.
Spot on. I couldn't agree more. Oh,
I mean
yes.
the conference for 2022, known as the COP27, was held in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt from the 6th to the 18th of November. The parties came together to talk about action towards achieving the world's collective climate goals. Um, and agreed under the Paris Agreement and the Convention. So there were heads of state, of government, and everyone interested in in climate change. And as everyone might have heard, we were the main theme on this episode was climate change, renewable energy, and all of that. So to me, COP27 was a mixed pot, both good and bad, almost like a good sweet and sour Chinese dish. This event was held in an African country for starters, and it was held in an African country other than South Africa, which is a good thing, because South Africa dominates the African continent in terms of these summits and events and global events. And the Middle Eastern flavor was palpable. And for a change, there were a lot of of delegations from African countries. The climate change message has reached all corners of the continent, and because Africa is on the receiving end of the impact on livelihoods of this change in climate. So that was a good one, because I also had friends who went there, and they came back and reported how beautiful it was. So we also had that other story where we talk about the just transition investment plan that South Africa, for some reason, decided to go unveil this plan at the COP27 summit. So that in itself was also a bad and a good thing, because there are all these in the heads of states, and we had this big begging bowl that the South African government showed up with. So, I mean, what the other thing that was the environment has become a public good, which is a good thing, because the UN General Assembly had a few acts that they passed on the same week, declaring that the environment is a public good, and this corresponded with the summit. That's a good thing. On the other hand, we saw a rollback on the Paris Agreement commitments by most especially the developed northern, the developed north, because at that same summit they were shoving this just unaffordable just transition plans on everyone, especially on low-income countries. They came in there, they preached on people, whereas they were not doing what they were preaching. They are not doing, as we have uh, uh, been explaining in this episode. So South Africa, uh, we also explained how the just transition plan is both a good and a bad, has both a good and a bad side, most especially the bad side. So what happened is that we saw private global financiers coming out of the closet. They were dangling carrots. They were in an open parade, saying to the world that they are going to appropriate public assets through blended financing. So what we call the Wall Street consensus, because what they are doing is that they're coming into the space of energy production and transmission lines, or talking about all sorts, but basically pushing climate change, this climate change agenda as some sort of like an asset class where they are going to come in and make profits. So my belief is that states, governments should spearhead their own transition plans, and have their own determinations, and they should do it as a public good, not for profiteering. It's a mixed bag, like I said. There were good things and there were bad parts, and I'm not saying getting private players into into this space, into the renewable energy space, is a bad thing altogether. But I'm saying it should be for the benefit of the people, of the commons. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with you. But I think for me, this highlighted two issues for me. The one, I think, is that, again, this is just another cup of empty promises, in my view. And it just made me increasingly more skeptical of this whole notion of net zero. And I must, again, explain or put a caveat that I'm not a climate change denialist. I just don't think that this net zero is going to be possible in the current plan time frames. Just simply because, I mean, there's just so much of our culture that still relies on use of carbon based energy. Whether it's people having a braai. I mean, we have a country we have a braai day, which used to be Heritage Day. Like, are we
Yes.
expecting everyone to shut off their braais? And I don't know, are we gonna have wind powered braais? Like, how's that going to work? I think all in all, I'm seeing that it's not likely that this is going to happen in 7 years, as some automotive companies have committed by 2030, or even in 27 years, with those who are committing to 2050. I think it's more likely going to take 100 to 150 years before we come close to anything close to net zero. But I think even then, there will still be some carbon emissions or some use of carbon based energy. It'll just be negligible. And so, though this huge rush, and I think that's the way in which financing always approaches issues, that, you know, given the many distractions, people don't care unless it's something they needed to do yesterday, which this whole just transition is being touted as. Okay, for me, that's the one thing, and it's just made me skeptical. And this whole energy crisis and climate crisis and environmental crisis is now being wrapped up in the geopolitics as well. But one of the things I think is a positive coming out of this COP27 was the call, actually, by developing countries for what is increasingly being known as climate justice, right? And
Yes,
the
yes.
idea is that, as developing countries or underdeveloped or least developed countries, because of the united single environment we live in, we suffer in part the climate change impact of emissions that come from these advanced economies. So Yes, firstly, they should be the ones who are doing the renewable transition in the most shortest time frames, but also they should also be helping to finance developing countries in their investments in renewable energy, etc., as a form of climate justice, given that we're at the front end of being affected in terms of livelihoods as a result of climate change. But it didn't get much traction. It was completely stamped out. You hardly even heard much reporting of these calls. But for me, that's really one of the only things that stands out from this COP27 conference that took place last November.
Yep, agreed. And then next time they should just say to all these conglomerates, especially the big polluters like Coca-Cola, hang back, keep your money. We'll find different sponsors. I mean, they should be.
That'll never happen. That'll never happen. But yeah, and it is that incestuous relationship, I think, between private capital, which is also embroiled in the pollution and everything, and governments trying to steer us away from this. It's quite ironic that in the current public discourse, the whole climate issue is placed at the foot of consumers, right? And that's a clear corporate strategy that started even in the early days of the ESG and environmental sustainability movements, that this is something that needed to be pushed on the consumer, when in fact, if you look at the pollution and emission numbers, there's clearly always a corporate multinational private firm that's actually polluting at the head of everything before we get to the level of consumers polluting through transportation, which I think is one of the biggest sources, and our demand for electricity, which is another major source of pollution. Beyond that, I think consumers have got negligible impact. The rest is mainly industrial.
Yep, exactly.
On that note, that brings us to the last story in the Global Geopolitics update. Chinese exports continue recovering in 2022. So, China's total exports increased by 10.5% to 24 trillion yuan, approximately $3.6 trillion dollars, compared to imports, which grew by 4.3%. Consequently, China's trade surplus increased to 5.9 trillion yuan, approximately $870.7 billion. So, meanwhile, China's trade with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the European Union, and the United States increased by 15%, 5.6%, and 3.7%, respectively. Meanwhile, China's trade with Belt and Road countries increased to 32.9% of its total foreign trade in 2022, and China recorded mild inflation in 2022, with consumer price index CPI increasing by 2% year on year, compared to the government's annual target of 3%. And China's producer price index, the PPI, increased by 4.1% year on year in 2022. Smo, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, well, the Chinese economy is well structured. That's my first point. Basically, in all respects, they invested heavily in their production capabilities and their supply chains. They've become really and truly the manufacturing hub of the world. So some had predicted that production would move away from China when their wages increased higher than they were, and that newer, lower wage competition would come along and take most of the production away from them. But that has not happened. You can also see how they planned the Belt and Road Initiative so well and executed perfectly that it has come, that initiative has started to bear fruit, considering that the Chinese, because you were talking about huge figures like 32%, the, the China had closed down their factory operations due to COVID, as we all know, yet their results have come to shoot the lights out. There was also a lot of talk about constricting China, the Chinese behemoth, when Donald Trump introduced all those import tariffs, and they banned some Chinese products from um, the U.S. market.
Mm,
But that effect has been almost like nullified. It's of no effect whatsoever, because China has got this massive infrastructure that they built over the past 3 decades that gives them the competitive edge. And this is why the Chinese have been insulated even from inflation, because production and supply chains, the sort of like shock-proof your economy from excessive demand or inflation.
mm, mm. And yeah, I think Chinese growth, I think, is just going from strength to strength, at least economically speaking. But as history has taught us, uh, when they can't win the fight economically, they come at you with their military.
Aish, aish.
And I think that's the corner that China is turning right now in its fight for economic dominance against the West and the US in particular.
Yep.
On that note, that brings an end to the Global Geopolitics update for this month. Being a premiere episode for this season, slightly different than we always do it. And what we've done this month is just going through a bit of a throwback on the worst and the best of 2022. And we'll now end the episode with a bit of outlook on what we expect this year to hold for South Africa, Africa as a continent, and the rest of the world. I think South Africa will continue facing some slow growth challenges, and as interest rates are expected to increase, this is unlikely to ease because domestic demand is likely to remain subdued. And we're more likely to see public protests, really, as we've seen with some political parties taking to the streets to protest against the NERSA tariff approved against ESCOM. We're likely to see more of that as also political parties are starting to weaponize or at least use the issue of the current political economic climate in for their own favor as the country faces elections in 2024. Spoo, any comments on your side in terms of South Africa outlook for this year?
Yeah, I heard this past week that we shouldn't forecast because someone said, who would have thought we would get COVID-19 back in 2018?
That's ironic, actually, because the Bill Gates Foundation had run a simulation precisely on COVID-19 before. So there are people who knew. I mean, there were publications coming out on the World Economic Forum agenda, which was preparing for a huge economic pandemic or public health crisis. So no, I think people knew about this, and in fact, the most recent one coming out of the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation is I think it's called the CARES virus, expected to hit by 2025. A similar respiratory and immuno pandemic, which I think is a worse adaptation of COVID of sort, but slightly different in its transmutability. But yeah, go ahead and check that out. The CARES pandemic expected for 2025. So I think, yeah, we should continue to forecast because those who are keeping their eye on these things are predicting and making announcements about expected catastrophe. It's just that maybe people aren't listening or they're listening to something else.
He went on to say, who would have known that Russia was going to attack Ukraine?
Again, I
And
mean, this we saw from 2014 already when the Crimean
yes,
Peninsula was under attack and they
yeah,
planted Zelensky, who came from a career of being a comedian into being the president. And he was known as a so called puppet of the West, installed by with the US pressure. Again, I think people who deny, analysis and people who track it, I think they're just apologists. We cannot live our lives with our heads in the sand. But go ahead, Spoo. What do you expect for South Africa this year?
Yeah. I think the forecast by the South African Reserve Bank was something like 2% growth and then going down to 1.5% in the following year.
Highly
So
optimistic.
very
Highly
optimistic.
optimistic. I mean, no ways. Okay, so I wonder. Look, I'm expecting us to just crack 1% growth from last year, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's partially because of the base effects in the previous year where we had, I think it was a 7 or what, I can't remember, a high growth rate due to the base effects of 2020. I highly doubt we'll knock off 1.5% for last year. 2% this year, I highly doubt. I
I
highly
mean, only
doubt.
now, only now is the just now in the past month or so or two, that we reached the same levels as 2019. So yeah,
Imagine.
yeah.
And I
So
guess
so
now we're entering stage 7 and 8 load shedding. It's unlikely we're going to crack 2% growth on those metrics. Sorry, continue smooth.
Yeah. So what I expect is that the ANC will change their tune. They've shown signs that they are about to change their tune in terms of their economic policies, because they are going towards 2024 and they better start uh, getting some positive results this year. And so what will happen, in my view, is that they will uh, go towards they will lean towards the towards more public funding, and they will forget a little bit about the our ceiling, our debt ceilings,
Mm,
um,
mm,
and what might come out will might be the big basic
mm,
income grant, um, and that will inject some new money into the system. And what might happen, but as you know, new money in the system doesn't mean it will circulate in the system. It might mean that your retailers will profit
mm-hmm,
more, like Shoprite and all. Yeah. So that's what is likely to happen, and we are likely to see more spending on the infrastructure side because there's been so much rhetoric in the last few days, and there's been talk about turning Post Bank into a commercial bank. There's been talk about the Reserve Bank expanding the mandate of the Reserve Bank, and to
ah,
include to include for employment, and that has come directly from um, a, what most will call a free market oriented thingy, financial minister Enoch Godongwana. So there's that. So 2024 will be on the minds of many, and it will result in some kind of economic uptick, I think.
mm,
So I'm
mm,
trying to be positive.
yeah,
So
yeah,
at least as long as we can get more money into the system, sort of like have some kind of a stimulus, because we didn't have a stimulus coming out of
mm,
COVID-19.
mm,
So if we can have a stimulus, even if we say that the ANC, which is the ruling party, is trying to buy the voters, but as long as it will be good for everyone. I mean, for job creation, for manufacturing. I mean, and I know that manufacturing decreased in November 2022. We want to see better numbers. So I'm trying to be positive and to think that 2024 will play in the minds of the decision makers. Yeah.
mm. I agree with you on the basic income grant. We're likely to see more peddling of the radical economic policies of the ANC. But for me, issues such as amendment of the constitution to expand the role of the central bank, it's like another land debate. which didn't
Yes,
need to
yeah.
take place because if the government had the political will, they could have expropriated the land given the current legal accommodations. So again, it's just pie in the sky discussions. That are not, I mean, even if we are going to say, okay, the central bank is going to target unemployment, what can the central bank do in terms of targeting that? Because already it's struggling to even do its monitoring and compliance of financial institutions. I mean, every 5 years or every couple of years, you hear about another financial scandal. Banks speculating against the rand, the VBS scandal, the Steinhoff issue, etc. All this financial fraud, let alone the systematized issues around illicit financial flows, which are completely outside of the control of the central bank, despite falling within their mandate. Then they can't even deal with that. I mean, what does that mean in policy terms when you've got a central bank targeting unemployment? I'm not sure. The issue of nationalizing the central bank. At the end of the day, the core mandate and the role of the central bank is going to be financial stability and surveillance of banking systems and surveillance of the non banking financial sector. Those things need to take place for central banks, regardless of whether central banks are government owned or not. Adding a mandate of unemployment, which government has not been able to achieve anything despite having that mandate and a core indicator in most of its policies for decades. I just am not certain what the central bank will do with an expanded mandate in that form. But correct me if I'm wrong. How do you see that working?
No, well, see, I think I don't want to go into the discussion about about the workings of the central bank. But I will say what they have said is that back in 2019, I think 2020, the central bank, where there was a liquidity shortage. And so the central bank did buy some government bonds. And I remember that. So they're saying that the central bank could also do a little bit more of that.
Or some monetary financing, basically. And we were always advocates of this. Personally, I was an advocate of this, right? Taking also a leaf. I can't remember the US writer who spoke about the deficit myth, right? That governments can, unlike households, don't need to work for their money. They simply speak to the central bank and print money. But
Yeah,
as we've seen in the
yeah,
US,
Stephanie Kelton, I think,
yes, Steph from the US.
Yeah.
So, as we've seen with the stimulus during COVID in the US, $6 trillion sent towards stimulus packages, or 6 trillion, if not more. The inflationary impact is quite clear right now. They're dealing with 8% inflation, which they haven't seen in over 2 or 3 decades. Um, you know, you have to have uh, 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 um, just simply providing people with incomes doesn't, without providing the necessary boost in production to meet that expected demand increase, is only going to lead to inflation. And I
Yeah,
think that's always been the central bank risk. I sound like I'm a conservative right now, but um,
yeah, you do, yeah.
but I've just seen it. I've just seen it. The thing is, you,
But
you can't
the
solve any
fact,
problem by throwing money at it. And I think this is fundamentally what some of the radical policy approaches are missing, is that, like, whilst you're still dealing with a highly monopolized and uncompetitive corporate environment in South Africa, I mean, we've had cartels for every sector, including bread. Like, you're not going to be able to yeah, you're not going to reach your transformation targets by pumping in money into certain areas just simply because people don't have the experience or the capital and ways to work the capital and network it into the production networks. There's just so many obstacles before that money can be matched with an increase in goods. Then you're still going to face stage 8 load shedding. What you going to do with the basic income grant then? Like, So anyway, I'm very skeptical. So yeah, over to you.
I think what the word that you're looking for is targeted. So sort of like in the US, the reason why there's so much inflation because that stimulus was not targeted at the low end. So basically, what you need is to stimulate employment, but make sure that when you come in with these interventions, the money doesn't go to your upper middle class um, guy who doesn't really need free money, who actually will take that money and go reinvest in the stock markets. And hence you got that sort of like a bubble in the US, which led to inflation. So if you target the low end, but then you are correct by pointing to all of these all the wastage in terms of these cartels um, and the concentrated South African economy. So you need to deconcentrate the economy first. You need to have strict restrictions on how much money you can have, all of that. So basically, there's a lot to do before you
Look,
can get this one. These interventions need you don't need only monetary interventions, you also need interventions in the real economy.
precisely. And my biggest worry with this approach, like take basic income grant for instance, this is something which, for me, I'm not even going to be condescending to say that money in the hands of ordinary South Africans is going to end up being spent on consumption, because I find that some assuming. But if you look at just the structure of the SA economy, that money for me would only have a circulation or a sustainable economic impact if we had a highly informalized economy. And because we have a formalized economy in South Africa, people aren't spending the basic income grants money on informal traders or people on the side of the road. They're spending that money at Pick and Pay Shop and ShopRite, who are also now the conduits where people receive these income grants in the first place. And so that money quickly gets into the formal system. And then what happens is you have a growth of the retail sector and the financial sector, which are sectors which have very slow or low income growth. And these are sectors that are non-productive. It's just, yeah, I just don't see it unwinding some of the problems we had. If we said an economy structured, let's say something close to Nigeria, for instance, where 50% of GDP is coming from the informal sector, then I would support basic income as a form of way, because some of that money, at least, half of it is going to end up in the informal sector. Those people will either buy more stock, etc. It's just that at this point, I'm not sure how many people, unlike the single guy who was publicized throughout all media for starting an ice cream business from the 350 rand. I don't know how many people who are recipients of these grants are waiting to start a business with these grants. And in the South African case, that is the only way that the basic income grant would be sustainable, is that if everybody was needing 1,000 rand a month or something to start a business, then that grant would allow them to start a business and employ people, and that's how it becomes sustainable. Right now, those 1,000 rands in the hands of people are only going to end up on the balance sheet of Pick and Pay, ShopRite, and Spar.
Exactly. So basically, targeting the concentrated South African economy, the
Yeah.
structure of the economy is what they should be doing. Yeah. Okay.
And then on that note, for me, let's take a look at what I expect on the rest of the continent in Africa. For me, I think the geopolitical fights are only going to become deeper and more advanced. As you spoke earlier, you mentioned that there's no plan in sight to end the conflict, because there's also so much money now that's attracted to the conflict, and the military industrial complex is in full operation feeding the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But I think where the West and the rest will be fighting is in winning over the hearts and minds of other countries in order to get support for whether that is interventions through the UN Security Council, further deepening of sanctions, etc. They would definitely be contesting for the hearts and minds of African countries and African leadership. And we've already started seeing this with the plans for country visits from the US and the EU, and even in the way in which they're more likely now to have an ear for some of the challenges that African countries are faced with. And I think one of the bargain chips that they're going to use is the debt relief, given that there's a rising problem of debt on the continent, in return for this sort of political support in the geopolitical tensions that are taking place.
Yeah. On my side, I think it will be interesting because, as you were mentioning, uh, something about the debt. There's this high debt in Africa. I mean, there's sort of like they're talking about a debt crisis, but I don't think it will get to that. I see China playing a bigger role because if you remember, I think one of the last story last year we covered the story about the U.S. Africa summit that they had in Washington, or is it New York? I don't remember. But what the U.S. has found is that China is a bigger competition than they thought, and so the Chinese are still going to play a big role, and I think there'll be more major infrastructure projects that are going to come into play, especially in Tanzania and places like places like West Africa, Nigeria. So I think there will be more investment from the Chinese into Africa, and the US might be pumping in some more money and trying to win over Africa. And Janet Yellen will be in Africa and South Africa in the next week or 2 weeks. So the US is coming in a big way. So I think there'll be more money floating around in Africa. So that will ameliorate that debt crisis issue that we were talking about. So that's how I see things panning out on the African continent. Yeah.
Sure, sure. I think the debt crisis may not be a widespread crisis, but it's definitely there. If you think countries like Zambia, which are currently in the common framework looking for debt relief, Ethiopia and Chad are also there now. Recently, Ghana has joined that list. Um, God forbid that there's another few countries that face the same crisis. And the problem, I think, this year is that there's a drying up of capital markets as a result of the rising interest rates from the US Fed and European Central Bank. But also, the Russia Ukraine thing has also dried up capital markets. And so, African countries are in need of financing, cannot find financing, and the cost of financing is quite high. And unlike 2021, where they got IMF support through the rapid financing facilities that they were prepared, which I think the IMF provided globally, I think $1 trillion through their concessional funding facilities. That's not on the table this year at a time when growth is slowing down, at a time when commodity prices are also kind of in a slump, at a time when countries also still need a lot more in terms of investing for further growth. And so it's that thin line that countries are walking on, that a lot of countries are finding themselves on the wrong side of that line. And that's where I think countries are going to come in. And they've already made a lot of calls through the G20 and other multilateral platforms for further debt relief, like what we saw during COVID with the debt suspension initiative under the G20. But I agree with you, it's still going to be a huge tussle for further investment on the continent. And I think a last point from me was just to say the fallout from all the military support being sent to Ukraine for a conflict that I don't think that Ukraine will be able to militarily succeed in, is likely to see a spillover of ammunition and arms, which is likely to end up in the continent, fueling further terrorism and extremism. In addition to obviously the money that's trying to turn the hearts and minds of Africans as this geopolitical conflict unfolds. So that is another major concern that I have on my side. Yeah, but there are speculations that Russia is likely to reach a peace agreement with Ukraine in the next 6 months, and but we're still moving slowly and ahead towards this pending global financial crisis. Which is very, very concerning. I mean, I read a recent article about concerns on Japan. So, Japan, unlike the European Central Bank and the US Federal Reserve, actually has been maintaining its interest rates unchanged over the last 2 years. And so now what they're faced with is low or negative interest rates and no space to raise them at a time when interest rates elsewhere are so high. And so what they're finding is that there's a rise in non-performing loans in the Japanese market, which obviously is going to spill over into the Asian market. And that, I think, for me, is the one thing that a lot of people aren't factoring in this global financial crisis. They might be looking at the US Federal Reserve response and the European Central Bank response and saying that they're acting now to avoid worsening of the crisis later. But I think the Asian markets are going to take us back to the 90s Asian financial crisis if Japan is not able to find a way from the current problem of disinflation that it's facing, low growth and high inflation.
But I thought the Japanese wanted high inflation all along, 2 decades, 3 decades without inflation.
Yes, so the challenge there is that they've had very low inflation because of the domestic demand linked to their demographics, right? An old and aging population that doesn't spend as much as a younger population. But the problem is that now they're faced with the global supply chain disruptions, which are the cause for the inflation. And as such, the inflation is being forced on them without them having the policy space in order to respond to it, because they haven't raised interest rates, they still have public borrowings from capital markets, which are very expensive. And so if they raise rates to respond to the inflation issue, they're going to lead themselves straight into a public default. And Japan is the most highly leveraged market globally. I think after the US, if not just more than the US.
I think more than the US,
Yeah. So that's really the crisis that they face, is that they have a thin line to walk in terms of cost of capital, which then doesn't allow the central bank to respond in the way that it would like to by raising rates in response to the inflation. So, yeah, it's one of those.
Interesting times
indeed. I think on that note, that brings an end to the episode for this month.
Good.